Manifesto of the Free Humans. Part 2. Our Vision of a Stateless Society. Chapter 6. Providing Public Services Peacefully. The time has come to start thinking unconventionally when considering alternatives to the current methods of funding community projects. As it stands right now, our civilization is forced to fund projects involuntarily through coercive taxation. The force and violence involved with the collection of taxes is only scratching the surface of the negative consequences that this practice has on our society. Let's take a moment to hash out the implications of coercive taxation. Since the government is allowed to extract money from the people by force, this guarantees they will have funds for any project they want, even if those projects are unpopular with taxpayers. This is because the public has no choice but to pay taxes, therefore they have no say in how their money is used. Thus, the tax-paying public, and not the agorist, end up paying for their own oppression and unjust wars around the world. Sure, there are some social welfare programs that assist people, but the cost of these projects are a tiny fraction of the money that is actually received via taxation. Most of the money that is stolen through taxation is used for bureaucratic budgets, collection enforcement, and the gluttony of federal and state governments. So while a portion of the revenue is being used for beneficial projects, a majority of the money is still being wasted or used for nefarious purposes. Imagine a thief giving you $5 while also taking $100 from your back pocket. One of the most common complaints about government is that it does not truly serve the public. The reason for this is simple. The government gets paid regardless of whether or not the people are satisfied. This means they have no incentive to actually listen to the public they depend on for funding. Likewise, the disharmony between the state and citizen inevitably leads to mismanagement, violence, and corruption. On the other hand, if community projects were funded through voluntary means, people would only pay for the services they wanted. This would likely lead to a lack of funding and the eventual collapse of authoritarian governments as they were faced with either extracting funding from the public using physical force or adjusting their own behavior. Under these circumstances, wars could be prevented, small businesses would have an easier time competing in the marketplace, and trillions of dollars in wasted overhead would either be back with its rightful owners or used in beneficial social projects and programs. If someone wanted to invade territories halfway around the world or put together an oppressive bureaucracy like the Department of Homeland Security, they would lose funding because most people would not willingly support their authoritarian adventures. This is the whole concept behind voluntarily funded community projects. Good service will render payment from the public, while poor service will lead to a lack of customer base and thus a lack of funding. There is an unbelievable amount of fear directed at this concept because for most of history, our civilizations have been propelled by violence instead of a balance of compassion and logic. Immediately upon hearing about these ideas of doing away with coercive taxation, many people who are new to the idea will immediately scoff, "If taxes are not collected under the threat of force, then no one will pay them. There will be chaos and poor will die in the streets." It's time to recognize that forced taxation isn't working for the average person, and ideas like the consent of the governed and the social contract are complete fallacies. We must acknowledge that there is a growing discontent among Americans. The two corporate political parties are losing support and people are losing faith in the system itself. Do we really think that the public would choose to sign a contract agreeing to have 1/3 of their earnings stolen to pay for the government's actions? If not, then it surely cannot be said that the system of involuntary taxation is any type of consensual relationship. And if the relationship is not consensual and voluntary, then it is not legitimate. If tax revenue was put into projects of value to the people, they would be more likely to voluntarily contribute money. Although our culture projects a pretty bleak view of human nature, our world is filled with a diverse spectrum of people who are kind and care a great deal about their neighbors. Recent studies have even shown that compassion might be hardwired into the human genome. Einstein believed that, quote, "If people are good only because they fear punishment and hope for reward, then we are a sorry lot indeed," end quote. So while it is true that people are naturally driven by incentives, most people also exercise empathy for their fellow human beings and are driven to help others when possible. In fact, helping others and the emotional reward it provides is often the incentive needed to drive people to help others. In fact, in 2010, people gave over $290.89 billion to charity. This is after the public has already been mugged for 1/3 of their incomes by the government and in the middle of the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression. Imagine how much they would have given had they been able to keep all of their income and had the reassurance of knowing their money was actually being spent correctly. Not to mention, imagine if all the money the public gives to wasted political campaigns was redirected to projects that the community actually wanted. There is currently a lack of confidence in the ability of charities to support our needs, and with good reason. Many nonprofits have succumbed to the corruption of our culture of dominance and become part of the nonprofit industrial complex, the unfortunate outcome of well-intentioned activists who become entrenched in bureaucracy. However, according to the 2008 data from Charity Navigator, an average of 80 to 85% of the money that is donated to charities actually ends up in the hands of the needy. That same report goes on to quote several sources who found that the government takes over 70% of all tax revenue collected and uses it for their own public funds, salaries, military projects, and wasteful bureaucracies. They also found that less than 30% of the public tax revenue is actually spent on the public. It was even suggested by the 1984 U.S. Grace Commission that nearly every dollar of income tax collected in America funds political corruption and pays this debt to the Federal Reserve. So even in today's world of subpar charities, those charities outcompete the state when it comes to improving the conditions and lives of those in need. These charities accomplish all of this on a voluntary basis, without threats, violence, or tax collectors. There is no need to force compassion, and anyone who claims that charity must be forced does not have your best interest at heart. The myth that the public benefits from taxation is just an elaborate advertising scheme that attempts to justify its existence. Even mobster Al Capone ran soup kitchens in Chicago so the people would overlook his crimes and see him as a charitable man. The government takes the same approach by spending some of their pocket change on welfare programs and community projects, but all of this is done out of an obligation to maintain the appearance of effective management of tax revenue. In a free society where public services and community projects were funded voluntarily, there could be various community groups that gather to discuss the issues important to the community at large. These meetings could be open to everyone and facilitated by alternating community members. These brainstorming sessions would allow the community to present suggestions for the allocation of resources. All suggestions would need to comply with the sovereignty of the individual. As mentioned earlier, freedomcells.org and nextdoor.com could help organize these meetings. There could be essential life-saving programs that would always be receiving donations and available to everyone in the community, whether they donate or not. Since these areas were so vital to life, they would likely receive the funding needed due to the high value of the service. For example, water treatment plants, firefighters, or community gardens would have no problem with funding because they are in high demand. When it comes to community defense, the public generally blindly puts their faith in the police and military. As with all other mechanisms of the state, these organizations are monopolies rife with corruption and inefficiency. Despite these obvious truths, the propagandized masses continue to credit these institutions for holding our society together. The popular misconception is that without forcing people to pay for those monopolies, there would be chaos and danger. However, other models for community defense are entirely possible without the need for state-sanctioned theft. Under the current paradigm, if you are upset about police corruption, you cannot simply stop giving them your tax dollars and search for another security provider. Instead of waiting for the state to fix the problems, there are private citizens taking matters into their own hands by organizing to provide security for their community. A great example of a currently existing alternative to the police can be found in Detroit. To counter the notorious corruption and ridiculously long police response times, Dale Brown formed the Threat Management Center in areas of Detroit where police don't answer 911 calls. Brown's organization fights crime, offers free protection for victims of domestic violence, and is also able to service poor areas of Detroit for free by charging a premium to work security in the city's richest neighborhoods. Two other important areas of debate related to providing services in a world without involuntary taxation are the roads and the courts. When it comes to the courts, the vast majority of civil disputes, especially in the world of business, are actually handled by non-government arbitration services. There is no reason why criminal cases cannot be handled in the same fashion. Anarchists who do not wish to use force to collect money for the public good are often asked, who will build the roads? Apparently, there are those who believe in the absence of the state, humanity will suddenly become incapable of laying down a dirt path or connecting roads into an interstate freeway. These people discuss the creation of government roads as if the construction was simply due to the kindness of government and not made possible by theft of taxation. However, what the government really does is collect money from private citizens under the threat of violence, then use that money to employ those very same citizens to build infrastructure. The reality is that people could build infrastructure themselves for less money if they coordinated with neighbors and other communities. In other words, if they just cut out the middleman. This exact scenario played out in 2009 on Hawaii's Kauai Island when private citizens performed a $4 million road repair job for free in 8 days. Beyond the basic necessities, a myriad of secondary programs and services from transportation, internet, and space exploration could also be funded through voluntary donations from the community. Remember, as a result of the lack of overhead As a result of the lack of overhead and enforcement costs which inflate all bureaucratic budgets, this would likely be cheap in comparison to the prices that we see today on public projects. Some may be concerned that it would be hard to achieve community goals on a voluntary basis, but this would actually improve the efficiency and value of public services. Oftentimes, government-funded jobs don't even see completion. It is unbelievably common for Western governments to start popular programs during election years to gain public support, only to later pull the plug so the funds can be used for wars or bailouts. This kind of manipulative behavior takes place all the time. However, when there is a project that has enough support, it will usually receive sufficient donations from individuals, business, and charity organizations to keep the program operating. This can clearly be seen in the explosion of online crowdfunding websites and campaigns. We also saw this in the US in 2011 when the government pulled the plug on the funding for the SETI space program in the midst of a half-dozen wars and major austerity measures. This was a program that the public felt so strongly about that over 2,000 donations were received in a single week, easily surpassing their goal of $200,000. If we think about this same problem presenting itself in the potential free society that we are discussing, we can easily assume that it can be solved in a similar fashion. Except this time around, there will be far less overhead and people will have more time to give to the cause, thus ensuring a greater success rate than we see today under the rule of the state. If people stopped contributing to a certain program, that program would put out word to its supporters to raise the extra funds needed to carry on the project. This is the wonderful thing about how our species self-organizes and uses their intelligence and resources to solve problems when they appear. When a need arises in a community, people naturally and spontaneously come together to take care of what needs to be done. They don't need a bureaucrat with a gun in their face forcing them to do it. For our species to have a future, we must start thinking about more peaceful ways of doing business. We must stop justifying the use of violence in all circumstances, even soft core violence like government legislation, taxation, and indoctrination.